Night, 1944. Somewhere along a shattered front, a radio crackles to life. The voice sounds familiar, calm, confident, certain. It speaks of retreats that haven't been announced, of divisions that no longer exist, of commanders who have already fled. Nearby, a soldier bends down and lifts a leaflet from the mud. The paper is damp. Official-looking, precise. It lists unit names, real ones. His unit. It promises survival. If he stops fighting, there are no explosions, no advancing tanks. Yet something inside the ranks begins to shift. Men glance at one another, unsure who still believes, unsure who still listens. Orders feel heavier. Silence lasts longer. Trust, once automatic, now has to be earned. This is not a battle fought with bullets. It is fought with doubt. And by 1944, the Allies had learned something terrifying. If you could control what an enemy believed, you could decide when they stopped fighting, long before the first surrender was signed. By 1944, the war had carved visible scars across Europe and the Pacific. Cities lay open, rail lines were broken, fronts stretched thin. But there was another battlefield, one without maps or trenches, where the damage was harder to see. Psychological warfare had existed long before World War II, but never at this scale, never with this level of precision. The Allies now treated morale the same way they treated fuel, ammunition, and air superiority, because they had learned a simple truth. An army that no longer believes cannot be saved by numbers alone. Across the Axis world, the pressure was relentless. German forces were scattered from Normandy to the Eastern Front. Italian troops fought with the knowledge that their government had already fractured. Japanese soldiers faced a widening gap between imperial promises and brutal reality. Supplies arrived late, or not at all. Letters from home spoke of bombed cities and hungry families. Rumors moved faster than orders, and isolation did the rest. As Allied air power tightened its grip, Axis soldiers became cut off, not just physically, but psychologically. They relied on radios for news, on scraps of paper for certainty, on anything that could tell them the truth about how the war was really going. That dependency created an opening. Allied planners understood that you didn't need to invent fear. It was already there, quiet, buried, waiting. All you had to do was name it, repeat it, make it sound official. By early 1944, this unseen front was no longer experimental. It was organized, measured, refined. Specialists studied dialects, unit cultures, even regional superstitions. Messages were tailored to sound believable, familiar, almost comforting. And slowly, something began to happen. Defensive lines still held, guns still fired, orders were still issued, but the belief behind them began to erode. Because when soldiers start questioning why they are fighting, and whether anyone is still fighting with them, the collapse does not come from outside. It begins within. By 1944, the outcome of the war would not be decided by surprise alone. The Axis still had armies, they still had weapons. In some places, they still had formidable defenses. But time was no longer on their side. Every month brought heavier losses, shrinking manpower, and fewer replacements. Every retreat carried not just strategic cost, but psychological weight. Allied commanders understood that this was the moment when belief mattered most. Territory could be retaken, equipment could be replaced, but confidence once lost was almost impossible to restore. For German soldiers, the myth of inevitability was cracking. They had been told the Reich could not lose, yet enemy bombers now roamed freely over their cities. Frontline troops heard of entire formations wiped out, of Allies surrendering, of wonder weapons that never arrived. For Italian forces, loyalty had become fragile. Orders came from a regime already collapsing. Men fought while wondering which side would exist tomorrow. And for Japanese soldiers, isolation was absolute. Units were cut off for months at a time, fed only by fragments of news and fading promises of honor and rescue. This made 1944 different, not because the Axis had stopped fighting, but because they were no longer sure why they were fighting. Allied psychological warfare was designed for this exact moment, not to shock, not to terrify, but to confirm the doubt soldiers were already carrying. A broadcast that hinted their commanders were lying, a leaflet that suggested surrender was common and survivable, a rumor that everyone else already knew the war was lost. Each message alone was small, almost harmless. Together, they formed a pressure no bunker could block. Because once an army begins to suspect that sacrifice is pointless, that obedience is wasted, that survival lies not in victory but in stopping, the battle is already turning. And the first cracks didn't come from bombs, they came from voices. Radios were supposed to bring clarity. For soldiers at sea, in forests, or buried deep in concrete bunkers, the radio was the only thread connecting them to the world beyond their position. It carried orders, news, reassurance. And in 1944, it became one of the most dangerous weapons of the war. Allied psychological warfare units understood something fundamental. People trust what sounds familiar. So instead of shouting propaganda from a distance, they spoke softly, in the enemy's own voice. Fake Axis-style broadcasts began to appear across the airwaves. They used the same cadences, the same military phrasing, the same restrained, authoritative tone listeners were trained to obey. Nothing about them sounded foreign. These broadcasts didn't praise the Allies. They didn't call for revolution. They didn't sound angry. They sounded tired. Announcers spoke like loyal insiders who had seen too much. They acknowledged losses that official channels denied. They hinted at internal disagreements, logistical failures, commanders protecting themselves while ordinary soldiers paid the price. For German listeners, especially sailors and frontline troops, this was devastating. U-boat crews, isolated for weeks beneath the Atlantic, tuned in to what they believed were German broadcasts. They heard reports of ports destroyed, of resupply routes compromised, of other boats never returning. Sometimes the information was true, sometimes it wasn't. What mattered was that it felt true. The broadcasts referenced real units, real officers, real locations. They sounded like men who knew what they were talking about, because they often did. To civilians, the messages were subtler, but no less corrosive. They spoke of cities already lost, of Allied landings described as inevitable rather than repelled, of sacrifices no longer leading to victory, only delay. Listeners began to notice contradictions. Official news promised triumph. The other voice, calm, resigned, described a war slipping away. And once that contrast existed, it couldn't be unheard. Soldiers began to wonder which version was closer to reality. Civilians questioned why bad news always arrived late or not at all. Trust fractured quietly, without drama. Because when propaganda sounds desperate, it fails. But when it sounds honest, when it sounds like your own side telling you what no one else will, it doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like the truth finally breaking through. And once doubt entered through the radio, it didn't stop there. Soon it would have something tangible to hold on to. The most effective broadcasts didn't lie outright. They blended truth and fiction so closely that separating them became impossible. Allied operators studied captured documents, intercepted messages, and interrogation reports. They learned which units had suffered losses, and which. Commanders were already distrusted. They knew which ports were damaged, which convoys were late, which divisions had quietly disappeared. Then they went on the air. A broadcast might begin by correctly naming a U-boat that had failed to return. It would mention a real patrol zone, a real date. Only then would it slip in the falsehood. That resupply was being diverted elsewhere. That high command had written the crew off as expendable. That the War Ministry already considered the Atlantic campaign lost. To a sailor listening in the dark, thousands of miles from home, this was not propaganda. It was confirmation of a fear he already carried. On land, frontline broadcasts followed the same pattern. They spoke of units being rotated out, except yours, of officers reassigned to safety, of reinforcements promised, then quietly canceled. Sometimes the message ended with nothing dramatic at all. Just a pause, a suggestion to think carefully before following the next order. That was enough. The goal was never panic. It was hesitation. A commander who delayed an attack, a sentry who waited too long before raising the alarm, a crew that chose caution instead of aggression. The human reaction was subtle, but devastating. Men stopped discussing what they heard aloud. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Glances lingered a second too long. Silence spread, not because soldiers had nothing to say, but because saying it felt dangerous. Who could be trusted? Who was still loyal? Who had already accepted that the war was lost? Commanders sensed it. Orders were followed, but without conviction. Initiative faded. An army can survive confusion. It can survive fear. What it cannot survive is suspicion, the quiet belief that someone, somewhere, is lying to you. By the time official channels denied the rumors, it was already too late. The damage wasn't in what the broadcasts claimed. It was in what they made impossible to believe. And soon, the voices on the radio would be reinforced by something far harder to ignore. By itself, doubt is fragile. A rumor can be dismissed. A voice on the radio can be switched off. A suspicious report can be blamed on poor reception or enemy trickery. Allied planners knew this. If psychological warfare was going to work, it couldn't rely on imagination alone. It had to be reinforced, made physical, made impossible to ignore. The radio had opened the mind. Now something had to enter the world, because doubt that remains abstract can fade, but doubt that arrives in your hands, that can be read, folded, hidden, reread, that lingers. Axis soldiers might argue about what they heard over the air. They might convince themselves it was exaggerated or false or planted. But what happens when the same message appears again? Printed, official-looking, precise, lying in the mud beside a rifle. What happens when it names real units, real casualties, real commanders? At that point, the question is no longer whether the voice was lying. It becomes, why does this match what I'm seeing? Psychological warfare had reached its next phase. The Allies were no longer satisfied with planting doubt. They wanted to surround it, trap it, make it unavoidable. And so, as aircraft crossed the front lines under cover of darkness, something else drifted down with them. Not bombs, not flares, messages. Soon the lies would fall from the sky. They didn't explode. They drifted. By the millions, leaflets fell from Allied aircraft onto forests, beaches, cities, and front lines. They landed in trenches, on roads, inside abandoned buildings. They stuck to wet uniforms and clung to barbed wire. At first glance, they looked harmless, just paper. But each one was designed with the same care as a weapon. These were not generic messages. They were tailored, by unit, by region, by language, even by recent events. Some leaflets named specific divisions and listed their losses. Others referenced battles that had ended only days earlier. Some were written in formal military language. Others used slang, humor, or bitterness. The goal was precision. A soldier who read one of these messages was meant to feel singled out, as if the enemy knew exactly who he was, where he stood, and what he feared. Many leaflets spoke of abandonment. They claimed commanders had already escaped west, that reserves no longer existed, that reinforcements were being saved for someone else. Others focused on inevitability. Maps showed encirclements closing. Arrows pointed only one way. The war, they suggested, was already decided. This was just the cleanup. And then there were the most dangerous messages of all, those about survival. Some explained how to surrender safely, which roads to take, what gestures to make, what words to say. They promised food, medical care, life. For soldiers who had gone months without rest, warmth, or certainty, that promise cut deep. Commanders ordered the leaflets destroyed on sight. Men were told not to read them. But paper is easy to hide, and curiosity is hard to suppress. A leaflet could be folded into a pocket, read at night, shared quietly between friends. Unlike radio broadcasts, these messages couldn't be dismissed as static or interference. They were tangible, repeatable, and worse, they often matched reality. The mail had stopped coming. Supplies were scarce. Orders contradicted each other. The leaflet didn't have to convince a soldier to surrender. It only had to make him wonder whether continuing was worth the cost. That was enough. Because once the idea of survival took root, once fighting was no longer the only imaginable future, the paper had done its job. And in some cases, the Allies found ways to make that paper feel even more official. By late 1944, Allied planners took the idea of propaganda one step further. They didn't just drop messages near the enemy. They sent them through the enemy's own systems. Operation Cornflakes was built on a simple, unsettling idea. If a message arrives the way official mail does, it feels unquestionable. Allied aircraft bombed German trains carrying mail, not to destroy the letters, but to scatter them. In the wreckage, forged mailbags were quietly mixed in. Inside them were fake newspapers and official-looking correspondence, printed to resemble German publications down to the smallest detail. Same layout, same typeface, same tone. When postal workers recovered the mail, they couldn't tell which bags were real. They delivered everything. And suddenly, propaganda wasn't falling from the sky. It was arriving by post. Civilians opened newspapers that looked authentic, but carried grim, carefully shaped stories. Reports of defeats framed as unavoidable, editorials questioning leadership competence, articles suggesting the war was already lost, even if no one dared admit it yet. For soldiers, the effect was worse. Frontline troops received letters and papers that appeared to come from home, from their own institutions, from a system they had trusted their entire lives. There was no enemy voice to reject, no obvious source to blame. If even the mail carried bad news, if even official print admitted collapse, then what could still be trusted? The psychological impact was profound. People stopped believing in the distinction between truth and lies. They no longer asked whether a message was propaganda. They asked whether anything wasn't. And when trust collapses at that level, resistance follows. Because an army can endure hardship, it can endure fear. But when its own words begin to betray it, when reality itself feels compromised, the will to continue doesn't break loudly. It simply drains away. By 1944, the Axis was no longer a unified machine. Beneath the uniforms and slogans, old fractures had widened. Allied psychological warfare was designed to find those cracks and force them open. Ethnic divisions were quietly emphasized. Foreign conscripts were reminded that they were dying for someone else's empire. Rumors spread that certain units were being sacrificed first, sent into hopeless battles so others could be spared. Political distrust was nurtured just as carefully. Messages hinted that party officials had access to food, safety, and evacuation routes denied to ordinary soldiers. That loyalty was being rewarded selectively. That survival depended less on courage than on connections. And then there were the whispered betrayals. Fake orders circulated, contradicting real ones. Instructions appeared that sent units in opposite directions. Some messages suggested neighboring formations had already surrendered or were planning to. The intention was never clarity. It was confusion. When soldiers couldn't be sure whether an order was genuine, they hesitated. When officers couldn't be sure who was loyal, they tightened control. And when trust disappeared, cooperation followed. Paranoia spread faster than truth ever could. A careless word became suspicious. A question sounded like dissent. Silence felt safer than conversation. Men began to watch one another instead of the enemy. In some units, fear of internal accusation became stronger than fear of Allied firepower. In others, resentment simmered against officers, against political overseers, against allies who seemed better supplied or better protected. The Allies didn't need to invent new hatreds. They only had to suggest that everyone else had already chosen sides. And once that belief took hold, it fed on itself. Cohesion fractured, discipline hardened, then cracked. Initiative vanished, because an army divided against itself doesn't need to be defeated in battle. It defeats itself. One doubt, one rumor, one whispered betrayal at a time. There was no single moment when Axis morale collapsed, no flag lowered, no announcement made. Instead, it faded. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence began to notice patterns that couldn't be explained by battlefield losses alone. Units withdrew without orders. Positions were abandoned overnight. Entire formations surrendered to forces they still outnumbered, not because they were surrounded, but because they were finished. Desertion increased quietly. Soldiers slipped away during movements, during night watches, during moments when no one was looking. Some tried to go home. Others simply disappeared. Surrenders followed the same pattern. Men approached Allied lines cautiously, hands raised, weapons left behind. Many carried leaflets in their pockets. Some followed the instructions printed on them exactly. They did not look defeated. They looked relieved. Interrogations revealed the same explanations again and again. They no longer trusted their commanders. They believed the war was already lost. They saw no reason to die for decisions made far away by people who would never share the risk. In some cases, soldiers refused orders outright. Attacks stalled before they began. Counteroffensives dissolved into hesitation. Artillery remained silent when it was needed most, not out of cowardice, but out of calculation. These men were not panicking. They were choosing captivity over obedience, life over sacrifice, certainty over slogans. This was the quiet devastation of psychological warfare. No burning wreckage, no dramatic last stands, just empty trenches, abandoned equipment, and an enemy that seemed to evaporate rather than collapse. The weapons still worked, the defenses were still there, but the will to use them that had already been destroyed. And once morale broke at scale, the consequences moved far beyond individual soldiers, because when belief disappears, entire fronts unravel. Once morale broke, the battlefield changed, not in the noise of combat, but in its absence. Allied advances that should have been costly moved faster than expected. Defensive lines folded with minimal resistance. Strong points surrendered after brief contact, sometimes without firing a shot. This wasn't because Axis forces lacked weapons. It was because they lacked belief. Psychological collapse turned every setback into confirmation that resistance was pointless. A single retreat triggered another. One surrender encouraged the next. Commanders found themselves issuing orders into a void. Units acknowledged instructions, then failed to act. Plans unraveled before the first engagement. For the Allies, the effect was immediate and measurable. Battles ended sooner. Casualties dropped. Momentum built. The enemy wasn't regrouping. They were dissolving. In places where resistance did occur, it was often uneven. Pockets of fanatical defense surrounded by units that had already mentally checked out. This made the collapse feel sudden, even though it had been building for months, because psychological warfare doesn't announce itself when it works. It only becomes visible when the enemy stops fighting. The war of whispers had done what bombs alone could not. It had shortened battles before they began. It had saved Allied lives without appearing on casualty reports. It had turned inevitability into reality. By the time Axis commanders realized what was happening, there was no way to reverse it. You can reinforce a position, you can replace equipment, but you cannot order belief back into existence. The open secret of 1944 was finally clear. The war of whispers worked. There was a weight to this victory that couldn't be measured in territory or casualties. Psychological warfare did not destroy cities. It did not leave craters or wreckage behind. It worked somewhere far quieter, inside the human mind. Allied planners understood they were not just weakening an enemy. They were reshaping how men thought, trusted, and decided. They were turning fear into a weapon, doubt into leverage, hope into a bargaining chip. And it worked. But that success carried questions that had no easy answers. Was it mercy to convince a soldier to surrender and live, or cruelty to dismantle his sense of reality until fighting felt meaningless? Psychological warfare blurred lines that traditional combat never touched. There was no clear front, no uniformed enemy to confront, only thoughts, guided, nudged, redirected. In 1944, the Allies justified it as necessity. The faster the enemy stopped fighting, the fewer would die. Every unit that surrendered spared lives on both sides. That logic was difficult to argue with, and yet, once the war ended, the method did not disappear. The lesson was too powerful. If belief could be manipulated, if truth could be bent until it no longer mattered, then wars no longer needed to be won only with force. They could be won by shaping what people accepted as reality. 1944 proved that an army could be defeated before it was destroyed. And that realization did not fade with victory parades or peace treaties. It carried forward into new conflicts, new technologies, new battlegrounds. Because once humanity learned how to fight inside the mind, That war never really ended. When the fighting stopped, the leaflets were swept away. The radios went silent. The voices disappeared. But the method did not. In the aftermath of 1945, military planners across the world studied what had happened in 1944 with careful attention. Not just the battles that were won, but why they ended so quickly once momentum shifted. The conclusion was unavoidable. Psychological warfare had not been a supporting tool. It had been decisive. 1944 became the blueprint. Governments learned that control of territory mattered less if control of perception was lost. That morale could be weakened long before supply lines collapsed. That truth, once destabilized, was harder to restore than any bridge or factory. In the decades that followed, these lessons were refined rather than abandoned. Radio gave way to television, leaflets to broadcasts, whispers to narratives. Modern conflicts would no longer rely solely on tanks and aircraft. They would begin with influence campaigns, disinformation, and carefully engineered doubt, designed to fracture societies before armies ever moved. Civilians became targets alongside soldiers. Public trust became terrain. Belief itself became something to be contested. What the Allies proved in 1944 was not just how to defeat an enemy faster, but how to make resistance feel pointless before it ever formed. And once that realization existed, it could not be undone. Every modern conflict now carries the shadow of that invisible war, not always obvious, not always acknowledged, but always present. Because the tools that broke Axis morale did not belong to a single moment in history. They belonged to the future. When the war ended, the battlefields grew quiet. Weapons lay where they had been dropped, rifles stacked without ceremony, artillery left unmanned. In bunkers and barracks, radios sat intact, their dials untouched, their voices gone. Leaflets still lay scattered across the ground, some unread, some folded and hidden away. Messages meant to end a war, now meaningless scraps of paper. There was no victory parade for this kind of warfare, no monument for the doubts that had broken armies apart, no record of how many lives were spared because someone chose to stop fighting. Only absence. Empty trenches where men once waited for orders, silent airwaves where familiar voices had spoken. A war that ended not with a final command, but with a decision made quietly, alone. The story of 1944 is not just about how the Axis was defeated. It is about how belief itself became a weapon, and how once that weapon was unleashed, it could never be put away. If you found this story worth remembering, consider supporting the preservation of these unseen histories. Share your thoughts below. Had you ever considered how much of World War II was fought without a single shot being fired? Because long after the guns fall silent, the war inside the human mind continues.